Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 27th Cultural Season Lecture Series for the al-Athar al-Islamiyyah. Tonight we have Mr. Seif El Rashidi, who is currently the Program Development Officer for the University of London's Layers of London project, a highly respected author of numerous publications. His latest book, written with Sam Bowork, is The Tent Makers of Cairo, Egypt's Medieval and Modern Appliqué Craft, published by the American University in Cairo Press. Additional research interests include the continuity of building traditions, the representation of identity in architecture, and the role of museums as educative establishments. Before we continue, we'd like to make sure that everybody gets to turn off their mobile phones or put them on silent, please. Tonight's lecture, entitled Textile Palaces, The Remarkable Survival of an Egyptian Craft. In this talk, al-Rashidi will reveal the long and evolving history of magnificent ceremonial tents in Egypt. These temporary palaces were used for social and political occasions for millennia. Discussing these tents in context, he will shed light on the social and political events that took place in public and use these tents to impress foreign dignitaries and local subjects alike. The talk will also discuss the surprising survival of this magnificent craft until today, shedding light on the current status of the craft. This will include a discussion of the efforts to preserve and revive it through design-led projects and national and international exhibitions. Let's have a warm welcome for Mr. Seif El Rashidi.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's so nice to be here, especially that I was supposed to give this lecture about 4 years ago, I think, and it got postponed several times for COVID, so to finally be in Kuwait is amazing. And thank you for preferring me over football. So I'm going to talk about the history of this textile tradition related to tents, and also talk about the situation today and efforts to revive and ensure that the craft survives. And tents, the word tents I think is often misleading, because the tents I'm talking about are urban tents, which are generally used partially in cities and partially for travel, but they're not the small tents that you go camping with most of the time. So to give you an indication of what I'm talking about, this is King Fuad of Egypt in the 1920s, sitting in what looks like a heavily decorated room, but actually it's not a room, it's a tent. And King Fuad was in Mahalla Kubra, visiting a factory, and often when the ruler of Egypt or important dignitaries traveled outside the capital, because there was no space large enough to host them in style, the tradition in Egypt until the 80s was for them to be hosted in a handmade tent like this one. So it was really a portable palace. And if you want to see how they're made, you could take a plane to Cairo and actually see it for yourself. But this photo shows you they're made of appliqué work, which is similar to quilting. You sew one piece of fabric onto another. It takes a lot of time. As you see, it's a man doing it. It was mainly, it's been a tradition mainly dominated by male craftsmen, because the tent panels are very large and heavy. They're usually around, today, it's a module, and the module is 6 meters by 3 meters, or 575 by 275. So they're big, large, heavy panels, and a big tent like the one you saw the king in would require maybe 100 panels or so. And this, Sheikh Hessa was asking me about the tradition itself. This picture summarizes it quite well, because the panels are repeated. Today they're square, they're rectangular, and a street of craftsmen makes them. Businesses called the Farashin own them, and if you want to have a wedding, for example, you go to the Farash of your neighborhood and you say, I want to have a wedding, can you come and see what kind of tent I need? And they come and measure, and they create a tent called a Suradik or a Suwan, in accordance to the size, the space available multiplying their units of 2.75 centimeters wide by whatever space is available. The people that put them up are not, they don't work for the Firasha business, they're separate people. You go and find them at a special coffee shop, and they're very good at climbing ladders, and they're not afraid of heights. And they usually put these tents up in a few hours and take them down the next day. So it's a very, when you think about IKEA today, the traditional tents in Egypt that are still used and have been used for over 1,000 years follow the same principle, that it's made up of units, so you can dismantle them, you can erect them, you can change them, and they're portable. But let me take you a bit into history first. So the idea of sewing a piece, something colorful on another fabric, or in this case leather, is not a new one. It's not peculiar to Egypt. It was found in many, many places around the world. This is actually from Egypt, though. It's a pharaonic tent canopy of a princess. It's about 2,000 years old. And if you look, you'll see the principles of what makes a ceremonial tent. That it's decorated, but it's meant to be seen from a distance. And so contrast and the use of color is a very important part of it. No one goes and looks very closely at the tent like this. They will see it. Imagine that the space we're sitting in is a tent, and most of you will sit quite far away from the walls. So if you're going to spend time and effort decorating it, what you do is you produce decorations that can be seen and read visually from a distance. I should say that Egypt is one of those countries that has a very long tradition of very fine textiles. This is a Fatimid plate from the 12th century showing someone in a very elaborate garment, of which I'm sure the Sabah collection has fragments similar. And with textiles, like with any art form, the scale and the type of decoration that you use depends on what the use is. So if it's something to be seen from a very close distance, like a sleeve or a hanky, the decoration will be small scale, depending on where the viewer is supposed to see it from, like this garment with a very beautiful inscription. However, and this is a similar, look, this is my finger, so this is woven and it's about this big. With a tent, however, if you had tiny decoration, you wouldn't be able to see it from a distance, and so what you do is the scale of each piece of fabric sewn onto a different piece of fabric is quite large. So why were these tents so important? Partially because, think of an age before social media, before photography, an age in which, I think the principles of rule are partially about public presence, that you have to appear in public, people have to see what you're doing if you're the ruler. I had a job once, and at the beginning the people didn't like me, and I was speaking to someone working in this organization, a volunteer who was a doctor actually, and he said one of the principles of being a doctor is you walk around every day, and if people see you every day, they know that you're active. And the principle of these ceremonial tents, in a way, was similar. They were a vehicle for the ruler, in this case, either the Khalifa or the Sultan or the governor of Egypt, to appear in public. And the tent was also a status symbol. If the ruler had a good tent, it didn't just reflect on him, it reflected on the state itself. And so it's the same as a nice car or a private jet or a yacht. And in this case, it was like a building that moved around. So if you look at chronicles of Egyptian history, you'll find that there were many periods in the year when the ruler would appear in public to do something. And usually this would be in such a tent. One of the important occasions, for example, we know at least from the Fatimid period, so the 10th century, was the breaking of the dam that allowed water in from the Nile into a canal that filled an important lake in Cairo. And the breaking of the dam had many symbolic, it was a very symbolic event because it was at a certain time when they broke the dam and the water would flow in, it would flow into this building, the Nilometer, and the Nilometer, the Nilometer measured the level of the Nile in that year. And based on the level of the Nile, you knew whether it was going to be a good year in terms of crops or a bad year. And based on that, you determined taxes. So the Fatimid Caliph would appear at the breaking of the dam in a magnificent tent. They would put it up a few days before the occasion. Even people who weren't invited would come and look at the tent and admire it. You might never see the Caliph himself, but you would see the Caliph's tent, and as such, it would give you a sense of pride in being from this great nation or this great state. And one of the fortunate things we have is an account of the treasury of the Fatimid palaces. And the reason we have the account is that there was a period of civil strife in the late 11th century, and to placate the rebels who were complaining about prices rising, etc., as people often complain about, they opened the palace storerooms and started giving things to people who were protesting. And so there's a great description of what was in the treasury: rock crystal jugs and vases like this. But luckily, we also have an account of the tents. And so there were tents of gold and silver thread, tents with animals, with birds, with lions. One thing about textiles is that it's very easy actually to transport fabric. And so not all of the tents in this Fatimid storeroom were made of Egyptian fabric. Sometimes it could come from the south, from Sudan, from what was al-Andalus, from Syria. And so there's a huge trade in textiles going on, and luxury and something not being local makes it all the more exciting because it's hard to come by. So imagine this magnificent treasury full of all these different tents, which were they were taking apart and dividing and giving to people. And when they talk about lions and birds, these are the kinds of things they're talking about. This is not an Egyptian textile, but you have many such things from Spain and from Sicily as well, and from Iran, where you have birds flanking each other in this way. And so imagine these very colorful, beautiful tents made of different fabrics. And they were made of parts. As I told you, it's a tradition that you can, like IKEA. So many of them would have been the walls of tents, and then the roofs of tents. These are actually from the 19th century, this panel, but it's exactly the same tradition. And there were two types. One type which was a square or a rectangle, and another which had the advantage that you could put many different pieces together and adjust the size. And the other type is this type, the round type. This is not a very big one, but I mean, the royal tents were probably 50 or 60 times the size of this. And the way to think of tents really is as temporary architecture, as movable architecture. And so it's not just about them looking nice, but they have to function. They have to keep you cool. They have to make sure that there's a good ventilation of air, that the sun doesn't hit you in the eye. And so they would have had, we know from accounts that they had skylights and vents, and so there's a science to them as well. I mean, there's an engineering science that's much more about, does it look beautiful? Because the tent also has to stand up. It has to withstand wind, rain, and so there's an element of structure and an understanding of structures in their design. And given that it's football season, I thought I should show you, when you look at the historic accounts from the chronicles, they tell you that some of these tents were 80 cubits wide or 100 cubits wide, so the width of a football pitch. I think that many of these accounts are slightly exaggerated. The tents were very large, and it's not difficult to cover a large space, but it is difficult to achieve great height without the tent collapsing. And when I show you some of the descriptions, I feel that they were probably exaggerated by the chroniclers. A colleague of mine, Matt Saba, who's been doing work on the Abbasids, noted that actually in Abbasid times, so say the 9th century, Abbasid caliphs would sometimes build palaces to look magnificent, but they didn't have to last very long because they knew that ultimately they would disappear. And what was more important was that people would remember them and describe them and write about them. And the Abbasids figured out that actually, as long as people wrote about things, that was what would preserve your memory. And that, so designing things that captured the eye and you could describe easily was something very desirable. And I think that with these tents of the royal storeroom in Fatimid Egypt, which were exaggerated by chroniclers, they had been designed also partially in that way, that to capture the imagination and to survive in literature. And I'll tell you why I think that. So when you look at the descriptions of these tents and how high they're supposed to have been, some of them are as high as the water towers in Kuwait City, which is, I would say, highly unlikely for the 11th century. And I would say that the dimensions that are really more or less realistic for at least the height of tents is the kind of dimension you see in this picture. This woman is actually, the height of the tent is what you see, the width, so it's about 7 or 8 meters. This is a real piece from the 19th century that her great-grandfather bought and kept in a storeroom. So we know that the tradition was to create huge things, but the huge of reality and the huge of a chronicler's description sometimes differs. Obviously, with tents that would have housed or entertained the Fatimid Caliph as he opened the dam or visited a new palace or celebrated the Eid or Ramadan, they did require, I mean, they were places to host hundreds of people, and the accounts tell us that some of them required 100 camels or more to transport from one place to another, and that some of them took 8 or 9 years to make. And I have a nice story actually that's related to this museum. One of the people who works on the collection, I gave a talk in London and she attended the talk, and she said, oh, you know, I live in London and it's always raining. Whenever I have people and invite them in my garden, it rains. And I'd like to make one of these Egyptian tents because I think it's the ideal thing for me. So I went to the tent maker's souk and I asked them, and they found 4 older people who had not made a tent since the 90s. This was in 2019. And they made one exactly using the same traditions, the same patterns of the older ones. And it took them about 3 months to make a piece that's about 8 meters by 6 meters. So when you think about the accounts that it took many years to make a tent, it's probably true. And this is it when it's finished. And one of the things, well, you find 2 things often appearing on these tent textiles. This one's also from the 19th century in the tradition, in an older tradition, is that they loved wild animals and sometimes fantastic creatures like unicorns and griffins. These are 2 lions that you can see chained. But also, one of the things that appears all over Islamic art and architecture is writing, inscriptions. Doris Abu Seif has just published a book about the metalwork in this collection here. And one of the things she comments on is what people chose to write depending on what an item was used for. And with the tent tradition, often the writing is about hospitality and welcome and about the tent being a paradise on earth. That it's like a world that doesn't exist anywhere else. It's so beautiful. And you create that world in fabric, in depictions of birds and lions, as you can see here. Here's another one with little lions on. And these are the animals that you would find in metalwork and on ceramics and glass, captured in textiles on the tents described in the Fatimid storerooms. So imagine them not just as places of ceremony, but also places of entertainment. And we have accounts of performers, of dancers, musicians, that this was a place where the court appeared in public. And so you might not be inside the tent, but sometimes you could hear the festivities and enjoy the festivities as an outsider in the city. Okay, so I worked out from the descriptions of the tent storerooms, that you could actually get tree trunks high enough to create the tents that they describe of 30 cubits high, like this tree you see on the left. But actually, I just feel that in terms of fabric, in terms of putting them up, it's unlikely. But the royal tents, being such big investments, like palaces, also had names. This one was called al-Qatul because on the first day when they came to put it up, a bit of it fell and it killed 2 people. So not a very good name for it, but that's what they called it. There was another one called Dar al-Batikh, the house of watermelons, because it had a dome in the center and then 4 domes around it. And so it looked like, I suppose, something like this. We also know that the fabric was velvety and iridescent, so it changed color. And one of the concepts that appears to have, the idea of capturing people's imagination and creating something that's remarkable and unforgettable is something that the tents you can do because you have access to, you can make them whatever color you want. It's not like brick and stone where you're more limited by the material. You can have shiny things, you can have things with gold, and so they can be magical places. And there's a concept in Arab art of this thing of wonder, that something is ajib or gharib, that you look at it and you think, oh, I've never seen anything like it. And I think that this tent, Dar al-Batikh, was probably one of those things. We're lucky that I mentioned literature and descriptions being the legacy of things that have disappeared. And in fact, we do have accounts of the tents of the Fatimid period. And it's interesting how they describe them as so high that you find birds flying around them and touching the clouds and the moon and the sun in conversation, but also at the bottom, gazelles. So you can see the imagery that these tents were supposed to capture. But there's also another imagery, which is the imagery of conquest and success, and saying, may we find this tent as far as Yemen or as China, and the idea of that may take you far and may your realms expand. Okay, here's another poem about the same thing. And in many of them, we sometimes think of them as singular spaces, but actually they were like palaces. They would have had different chambers, corridors connecting them. And some of the chroniclers complain that some of them were so complicated to put up that actually they never actually used more than a quarter of the tent, that it was such a big endeavor. So I think the 20th century ones I showed you are the result of 1,000 years of experience of how to make it portable. And the thing I want to emphasize is that these were not necessarily casual places. When the Fatimid Caliph in the 11th century or the 12th century went to the opening of the canal, he was holding court. He would ride in on his horse, as depicted on this plate, over beautiful carpets, and then dismount ceremonially and sit on the throne and receive people. So they were temporary spaces, but they were not spaces of informality. I'll just tell you a couple of stories that emphasize the symbolic importance of these tents. This one from the 12th century of Salah ad-Din watching a battle of his troops against those of Richard the Lionheart. And he's standing on a hill. The armies are fighting in the distance. His young son, who's 17, is standing next to him. And every time the young son sees his father's army go forward, he jumps up and down and says, "Oh, we've won, we've beaten them." So the first time he does it, Salah ad-Din doesn't say anything. The second time he does it, Salah ad-Din is also silent. And then the third time, Salah ad-Din loses his temper and says, "Listen, we haven't won until the tent that you can see in the distance there falls." At that point, the Muslim armies push the tent over and it falls. And Salah ad-Din gets off from his horse and kneels down to pray, to give thanks that his army has won. So there's a great symbolism. They were representations of the state, and sometimes in battle, they represented the survival or the fall of a state. And I think color is something that is quite significant. We take it for granted today. As I look around the room, you're wearing many different colors. But historically, certain colors were much more expensive than others. Red tended to be very expensive, crimson, especially this deep red, which sometimes came from a beetle. Yellow, which in its most expensive form came from saffron, which on this side of in the Gulf, you find it in cakes and things. Part of the reason that people love it is the color is very deep, but it's also expensive. And so the color of your tent was often a symbol of how important you were. So blue in general, or at least in Egypt, indigo was very common, and it grew on the Nile, and so blue was not a very luxurious color, I would say. If you look at the records, it tends to be red and yellow in combination that are the more expensive colors. And this is an account from a letter from the 11th century, probably in Cairo, in the Geniza, which talks about a client being dissatisfied with the shades that the dye master gave him. He says that one of them, he wanted it to be lighter, and so in the same way that we go to a shop today and spend hours deciding whether we want the dark blue shirt or the lighter blue shirt, people 1,000 years ago would have done the same. And as tents were a very big investment, you'd spend a lot of time deciding what you wanted. And the most expensive, supposedly, was something that came from a sea animal, a mollusk, it has these golden threads like hairs, and they would take it and weave gold fabric, which was incredibly, incredibly expensive. Okay, I'm going to move a little bit further in time to the 13th to the 16th centuries, which is really a very important period in Cairene history, the Mamluk period, which followed that of Salah ad-Din ruling Egypt, and was a period in which different emirs would rise to power, they would overthrow each other. It wasn't dynastic in the same way that you found earlier eras like the Fatimids. And so with this kind of political system, you get every 5 or 10 years a new person coming to seize the throne, commissioning a tent, building a mosque. And so there's a lot of energy in terms of design and creation, because competition creates energy, and it creates someone thinking, well, I want to be better than the person I replaced. And as a result, if you walk down the main street of medieval Cairo and look at the Mamluk buildings, there are many, many, in some ways, in competition with each other, like these mosques from the 13th and 14th centuries. One of the interesting things that I've noticed through my research is that there was a parallel between the designs on architecture in marble and paste and stone and the textiles produced at that period. So this emphasizes what I told you, that the tents were really a temporary form of building, or a portable form of building. This is a 14th century mosque, Aslam al-Athar, and my friend and colleague Dina Bakhoum, who came and spoke here a few years ago, was one of the people who restored it. But look at the panel on the right, which is above the entrance of the mosque, and look at the textile on the left, which is from the same period found in Egypt. And you'll notice that the design, the patterns, even the colors are very similar. And it's hard. People sometimes ask me, what do you think inspired? Was it the buildings that inspired the textiles, or the textiles that inspired the buildings? I think it's both. It's a style, and it's a period, and it's a spirit of a period. But these designs, the remarkable thing is that these designs are still made today. And when I looked and traced the patterns, I found that the patterns that appear in the tent fabrics stitched by hand are often inspired by the buildings closest to the tent maker's souk. So people see something out of the window or out of their shop, and they stitch it into the fabric. And here are some other examples with symbols of office. This is supposedly the Sultan's cupbearer, the Saki. This one says Azz al-Mawlana Sultan. So there aren't any surviving tents from this period in Egypt, but there are fragments that tell us about colors, about design, about how they were made, and that's what enables me to tell you that it's a tradition that continues. that what you see produced 800 years ago is not very different from what you can have made today. And it's through manuscripts and miniatures, not necessarily from Egypt, but from the same period in the Middle East, that you can capture visually what it would have been like to see these magnificent tents used by the various court officials. And when I talk about tents, one thing to remember is that it's not just tents, but it's also flags and banners. And these palanquins, which would have taken people on pilgrimage or on conquest. So the banner on the right is from the 19th century. The image on the left is from the 13th century. And look at the similarities in format and in design. And I think one thing, when you focus on a country, you sometimes forget that it's linked to other places. Many of these Mamluk emirs and the Mamluk system they were Turkic in origin. There were strong links to Central Asia, to other places, and there are parallels of the tradition you find in Egypt, in Central Asia, and also in India. So it's not unique, but it's distinctive. This is Central Asia. I'm just going to reflect for a second about the Mamluk period. This is the citadel. All of this, the seat of power, built by Salah ad-Din and used from the 13th century until the 19th century by the rulers of Egypt. You see, it's a huge place. And one of the things that's very striking is that when the rulers of Egypt decided to celebrate, for example, Ramadan or the Prophet's birthday or the Eid, they didn't celebrate it inside the citadel. They celebrated outside here. Why? Because they wanted people to see them. They didn't want it to be a private celebration. They wanted it to be public, that even if you weren't invited, you would feel that you were part of it. And in some cases, they would invite all the sheikhs, all the imams, all the religious figures, because part of being a good ruler is being a ruler for your people. And so celebrating in public in a magnificent building, a fabric building, is a good way of showing people that you care about them, that you're important to them, that you feed them with lovely food, and that you're doing your duty. And so we can only imagine what tents of this period would have been like from the stone and brick architecture, like this dome from the 15th century. And this is the dome on the left is from the 15th century of Sultan Qaid Bey. The tent on the right is from the 19th century, but you can see a very similar spirit. This is stone and textile. Stone and textile again. So I'll just tell you a quick story about Sultan Qaid Bey, who's one of the most important sultans in terms of building. He loved architecture. And he made a special tent to celebrate the Prophet's birthday, which they used year after year in the Medan, underneath the citadel that I showed you. Qaid Bey built some of the most magnificent buildings in Cairo, including the dome I showed you. And in 1496, there was a huge fire in the citadel, and the chroniclers said that they found the Sultan standing and crying. He was an older man at the time. They say that his beard was gray, and he was crying uncontrollably. And the reason that he was crying was that his royal tent storeroom had caught fire. And it took 3 days to put the fire out, and it turned out that apparently that the fire, or it was said that the fire was started in the kitchen of the Abbasid Caliph, who lived in Cairo at the time. And as a result, they asked the Abbasid Caliph to leave the citadel and move somewhere else. And the Sultan's emirs, because they saw he was so upset, went to their palaces and got their own tents and gave them to the Sultan, so he wouldn't be upset about the loss of these magnificent items that he had commissioned. Luckily, the one tent to survive was the tent made to celebrate the Prophet's birthday, which was a huge round tent which could take hundreds of people and was used on this, at least on this one occasion every year. Funnily, it turned out that actually the fire hadn't started in the kitchen of the Abbasid Caliph. It was someone trying to cause a problem between the Sultan and the Caliph, who was the symbolic religious leader, and came up with this story and framed the Caliph. But the fact that Sultan Qaitbay, this incredibly important man, was standing crying because his tents had caught fire is an indication of how important they were. I'll tell you this quick story of another Sultan, Sultan al-Ghuri, who used the tent of his predecessor Qaitbay for the same occasion, for the Prophet's birthday. And Sultan al-Ghuri in 1516 realized that the Ottomans were planning to attack him. The first thing he does is he goes and reviews the tent storeroom, gets the tents out, gets all the flags out, reviews his troops, and then after a few days goes to the north of Syria to meet the Ottoman Empire, which eventually defeat him. And the chronicles criticize the Sultan and say he was too quick in reviewing the army and in the troops and reviewing the tents. And the spies that must have seen him, because every army was always spied upon by someone, would have said, oh, this Mamluk army is not very strong. If the Sultan can review it in 2 or 3 days, we don't need to worry about it. But people still, as Sultan al-Ghuri went out to battle, like making noises and celebrating, praying for his success. Unfortunately, he didn't succeed, and the Ottomans killed him. Or he got a heart attack on the battlefield. And the chronicles tell us that one of the first things the Ottoman army did when they came and took Cairo was that they sold the tent used for the Prophet's birthday to a Moroccan merchant who cut it up, and they sold it for a very cheap price. And they say it was one of the symbols of the Mamluk Empire, and that Mawlid al-Nabi, the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, was never the same again. That the following year, in 1517, on the day of Mawlid al-Nabi, you couldn't really feel that it was a celebration because the royal tent was missing. But before that, we know how they celebrated the Prophet's birthday with these magnificent banquets of 1,000 chickens and marzipan from Syria and quinces, and so in great style. And this is just a representation, slightly fictitious, of the court of Sultan al-Ghuri. In this case, not in a tent, but still in a public place. So we do have some remains of pieces from the early 16th century which tell us what these tent fabrics were like. This would have been on the camel going to Mecca, the mahmal. As you can see, it's red and yellow, as I told you. It has the Sultan's name, Azz al-Mawlana Sultan. And it has the magnificent contrast of the red and the yellow, so you can see it from a distance. They had about 20 of these. Some of them were mainly red with some yellow, and some of them, like this one, is mainly yellow with some red. I'm going to skip here because, as I suspected, I don't want to run out of time. So we have a very good account from the mid-17th century about a Mawlid, a religious festival in Tanta, the Mawlid of Sayyid al-Badawi. And Ivleya Chalabi, an Ottoman traveler, goes on a boat down the Nile from Cairo to attend the Mawlid, which is still a very important Mawlid in Egypt today. And he describes the sight of a field full of colorful tents as being like a field of tulips. But he also says that when the Mawlid is over, this field of tulip miraculously disappears, and that what is left is just an empty plain with nothing but ants and snakes, and that it's like a metaphor for life itself, how you can go from this amazing state of festivity and color to everything disappearing. And I think actually that's what makes these tents exciting. They celebrate a moment, and if you had that moment every day, it wouldn't be less exciting. Like, for example, the hotel I'm staying in, I noticed today that they're putting a Christmas tree and Christmas decorations, and they have footballs for the World Cup. But these are temporary things, and that's what makes the lobby something that you think, oh wow, if the Christmas tree was there every single day or the football was there every day, it wouldn't be appealing. And so in Evliya's account of the magnificent Mulid and also its sudden disappearance in a day, you capture this sense of festivity and also the ordinary. And this is an Ottoman tent, not made in Egypt, but capturing, I would say, what Egyptian tents were like. And I just wanted to show you that until the 19th century, the rule, well, actually longer than the 19th century, this is Abbas Helmi in the Khedive, probably around 1913 or something, or the early 20th century, in a tent similar to the one I showed you. This is a Mulid showing you just how big and vast and how many tents you would have needed. And this, I mean, I spoke about what do these tents say, and they're often colloquial sayings, Egyptian sayings. One of them that appears a lot is, I'll say in Arabic and then in English, أعدوا نظرا تجدوا صنعا جميلا قد أقمت لك دليلا بمصر محاسن كل فن, which is, look again, I have given you the proof that in Egypt is the best of all art. And I chose this one especially for you, Sheikh Hassan, because to show you how similar some of the designs are to the doors of houses in Cairo, which you will be familiar with. I mean, you can see that the inspiration comes from stone and brick. And these are some magnificent tents surviving from the 19th century. So this tradition continued to be used for political affairs and state visits until the late 20th century. This is Gamal Abdel Nasser, like the Fatimid Caliph 1,000 years before him, and like the Mamluk Sultan and the Ottomans, appearing in public in a tent. This is the 1950s, a wedding in a family garden. And this is a sports day at a very famous school, Victoria College in Cairo in 1958. And actually it was the death or the assassination of President Sadat in 1981 that probably led to the end of the ruler of Egypt appearing in public in a tent because of security reasons. So from then on, the tradition divided into two. This is the event. The tents continue to be used for weddings and ceremonies and lots of occasions, but most of them are not used by very wealthy, very important Egyptians, and so the materials have become like just plain fabric, and I mean, they're less expensive, but they serve the same purpose of creating a sense of celebration. This is celebrating Coptic Orthodox Christmas on the 7th of January, in which you see they use the tent, but these are all, I mean, they're strips of fabric, and these are made on the computer, not by hand. And you can order whatever you want. What has survived, the handmade appliqué work tradition, has survived, but mainly for the production of bed covers and cushions and hangings, because to produce a tent is very expensive, and most people will now have a wedding in a hotel, and as I told you, the President of Egypt will never appear in public for security reasons. And so this is, these are two people who are very excellent, actually, tent makers, Tariq al-Safti and Hossein al-Farouk, probably in a USA exhibition, showing the intricacy of their work, because as they now produce smaller and finer pieces, well, as they now produce pieces that are seen much closer, people hang up in their rooms, or a bed cover or a cushion, the scale is smaller and the work is finer. One of the things that I've been doing for the past 5 years is trying to encourage designers to use this tradition in contemporary design. Because one of the challenges of all craft is how can it survive in an age when costs of labor are increasing, when mass production, the quality of that is also increasing, and that people can't always tell the difference between a handmade thing and a printed thing. And for a tradition like this one to survive, it needs support. It needs people to appreciate it. It needs people to understand where it comes from. And so I've been working with others on organizing exhibitions about the history of the tent makers, but also working with or encouraging designers to each work with a different shop in the souk and produce things that are contemporary but using handmade techniques. And one of the things we did, which was very interesting and I think important, is one of the people, the man Muhammad on the left, is a young tent maker. He's about 35, but he's also a banker. And so I thought he was very interesting because he understands the economy of things. He understands that if a bed cover costs, if a Khayamiyya bed cover costs 20 times the price of the best bed cover you can get in any other shop, no one's going to buy it. So what he's doing here is sitting with Naila Shishini, who has a craft shop, discussing how to make something economical, but beautiful. And this is one of the things we came up with. This is an old piece. As you can see, it's all decorated. These are bed covers inspired from the designs of Mamluk mosques, as per our tradition, but with slightly different colors. And this is, the outcome is something that it's handmade. It is based on tradition, but had this been made in the 19th century, the whole thing would have been covered with decoration and very expensive. Today, it just has one element of decoration. It appeals more to modern taste and the modern sense of aesthetic. And sometimes crafts, that's what they require, the marriage between tradition and modernity. I'm just going to go through very quickly. Here are some other things that we've worked on. All of these are made by hand in exactly the same technique. And this is an exhibition in historic Cairo. What we were trying to do was encourage wealthy Egyptians to come back to the historic city, to interact with it, to enjoy it, because it's been a place that has declined a bit over the past 50 or 60 years. And someone came up with, one of the designers worked with a tent maker, and they produced these very nice beach umbrellas and deck chairs. So sometimes it's an unusual result, but I think that's what innovation is. And finally, I'm happy that I'm only 2 minutes late. I wanted to tell you that crafts at their best respond to the world around them. They're not frozen in time. Had I given this talk 10 years ago, I would have shown you a piece that was inspired by the Arab Spring, capturing Maidan al-Tahrir in Cairo with people protesting. But given that we've moved on from that, I thought I would end with this piece, which says, كل حال يزول, every situation is transient. And this I found hanging up in Tariq's shop 2 years ago, and I said, oh, it's very nice, I haven't seen this design before. He said, oh yeah, because of the pandemic, I thought I'd make something that reminded us that everything will pass, including this pandemic, which was very difficult for the craftsmen because no one was buying things. So in my closing, I just want to remind you that in this long and venerable and very interesting tradition is also its survival. And I think its survival is dependent on one thing, that it corresponds to the world today. Thank you.